It's going to be a bitter winter for Europe.
Britain is facing a crisis of confidence from the financial markets, which actually has been years in the making.
With Russia turning off the gas and OPEC cutting output, energy bills are soaring. Inflation is at an all-time high.
The country now faces prices more than 10% higher. 10%, think about that.
Rising prices are weighing heavily on low-income households.
There are some real harrowing challenges around customers having to choose between feeding families or paying bills.
The wealth gap is bigger than ever. Women and minority entrepreneurs are feeling the crunch as VC funding dries up. And the rise of far-right leaders in Europe is threatening regression of LGBTQ rights. Against this backdrop, how can we create equal opportunities across social classes, geographies, genders, and ethnicity? We convene business executives, thought leaders, policymakers, and artists to create a blueprint for growth that leaves no one behind. This is the Bloomberg Equality Summit.
Hello, everyone. Thank you all for being here. Today, you'll hear from business leaders who are prioritizing equality, an increasingly important issue for employees, customers, and investors. You'll also hear from government officials who understand how this work can foster economic growth. The Bloomberg Equality Summit is just one example of Bloomberg's commitment to address the systemic inequities that exist across class, geography, gender, and ethnicity. As a company, we're focused on building a culture of inclusion and investing in all our people. And at Bloomberg Philanthropies, we're working around the world to tackle health disparities, including a woman's right to make her own reproductive health decisions. We're fighting climate change to make sure everyone has the chance to breathe clean air and drink clean water. And we're working to expand access to education for all students in K through 12, college, and beyond. Recently, we launched the Racial Wealth Equity Database to help close the racial wealth gap that exists here in the United States by providing leaders and experts with the data they need to tackle the problem effectively. We know we have a long ways to go. The pandemic has widened wealth gaps around the world, threatening economic growth and stability. And so this gathering really is critically important. I want to thank all of you for being a part of it and for working towards a brighter and more equitable future. I hope it's a productive day, and I look forward to hearing about the results.
Please welcome to the stage Rakshita Saluja, Executive Editor, Equality, Bloomberg.
Good morning. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Bloomberg Equality Summit. I am Rakshita Saluja, Executive Editor for Bloomberg Equality, and on behalf of Bloomberg, I am so pleased that you could join us today, both here in person in London and virtually from different parts of the world. We are pleased to have you. We launched this event 5 years ago in May 2018 and have been proud to host discussions on advancing equity in the workplace and in society at large. Today's theme is building a fair future, critical in the challenging economic time that we're in with high inflation, skyrocketing energy prices, and rental costs. In Britain alone, the cost of the most basic standard of living has jumped 20% this year. That's 6 times the pace of increase in previous years. When we launched Bloomberg Equality, one of our core missions was to chronicle inequality in all forms, issues of race, gender, and fairness, issues that matter to boardrooms and investors at pretty much every company that we cover here at Bloomberg. The fight for racial, gender, LGBTQ, economic equity, climate justice, and now the growing backlash that we're seeing to ESG are some of the most powerful forces that are shaping modern business, politics, and economic policy. So today, we will be hearing from leading voices in business, policy, technology, and the arts on the strides made and the challenges that remain to building a fair future for all. But before we get started, I do have a couple of quick announcements to make. First, I'd like to acknowledge our presenting sponsors, Boston Consulting Group and Principal Asset Management. And second, if you're tuning in virtually and have any issues with audio or video quality, try to refresh your browser. If that doesn't work, you can use the chat box at the bottom right of your screen for support. I do want to remind everyone here, both in the room and virtually, that you are vital to the conversations that are taking place today. So we will be polling you through the day, and we will have live Q&A as well. If you're in the room with us, this is how it'll work. You can respond to the polls that we put out or Q&A by scanning that QR code that's behind me on the screen. If you're joining us virtually, there's a widget and a Q&A function on your screen. So let's give it a try, shall we? Take out your phones, keep them on silent, scan that QR code. And all our polls are anonymous, so please answer them honestly. All right, so here's our first poll of the day. Given the current economic climate, which of the following is your organization currently de-emphasizing? I'll repeat the question as you scan the code. Given the current economic climate that we're in, which of the following is your organization currently de-emphasizing? Your options are A, pay equity, B, networking and mentoring, C, sustainability initiatives, D, hiring, and E, there's no change. Place your votes, and I'll reveal the results as soon as they start coming in. And while you answer that, I also want to let you know again that you can always send us questions by scanning that QR code. There's also a QR code outside in the pre-function room that you can do if you can't get this. All right, I think we got some results that are coming in. Let's give it another 5 seconds or so. But it seems like most people are saying that there's no change. That's a little surprising. Okay, I'll be honest, I was surprised. I was expecting hiring. Okay, well, I'm glad that worked. You can always engage with us on social media through the day, but you can use the hashtag on Twitter, Bloomberg Equality. You can find our content on equality at BBG Equality. You can subscribe to our newsletter by going to bloomberg.com/equality, and you can follow us on Instagram at Bloomberg Equality as well. Thanks again for joining us. I'll be back later on in the day to do a conversation around transgender rights. But in the meantime, I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Please welcome to the stage Anne Richards, CEO Fidelity International, and Bloomberg's Jacqueline Simmons.
Good morning, Anne. Good morning, everybody. So I think given where we are and the fact that you're based in the UK, it feels appropriate to start with a UK-focused question. Sorry about that. But I suppose my first question would be, how are you explaining turmoil in the UK markets to a global investor? And what does the disruption mean for companies, and companies especially that are trying to achieve their goals around equity and inclusion?
We've got about 20 minutes, right?
Something like that.
I was in Washington last week, and I was at a dinner, as you often are, in those situations. And the lovely chairman of a Greek company offered his commiserations for what the UK was going through, because he said he knew what it felt like. The UK context. Thanks, Jackie. The UK context is an interesting one. We've had 4 chancellors in 4 months. We're not really used to this level of political disruption at the top. And markets certainly don't expect it from the UK. I think the very short, sharp lesson that markets have given to the new leadership team, or the previous new leadership team, was that you can't take the markets for granted. Mm-hmm. And if you want to do big and brave and bold on the fiscal side, which is not a bad motivation necessarily to have, you can't do it if the plans don't back it up and don't link back to actually what is the affordability, what's going on in the bond markets. And the fact that we were in a situation where, yet again, the central bank, this time in the UK, had to step in as kind of the buyer of last resort in order to neutralise the disruption that had been caused by bold but not perhaps well thought through fiscal plans, or certainly not explained fiscal plans, I think that's not a great situation to be in. It does feel like that lesson has been learned, and quite quickly, really very quickly. So we're back to some level of, I think, composure, at least for the time being. It's worth saying that the global context is still quite tricky, and I think the lesson that has been learned from the UK, and is certainly being looked at by other central banks around the world, is that they really have become the only game in town. And as you know, the Fed is in its tightening cycle, and you've seen financial conditions tighten very markedly in the US. That lesson is being looked at very closely in the US as well, because you have a certain amount of room for manoeuvre, but not too much. And therefore, I think that sort of liquidity tension, that withdrawal of liquidity from markets, is seeing strain pop up in all sorts of pockets. The UK was just a very, very extreme example of it. And the second part of your question,
so you can't take markets for granted. The second part of the question is, what does all the disruption mean for UK companies that are trying to hit targets around equity and inclusion?
Well, I think it's been actually particularly disruptive for the SME sector, because we've had so many U-turns on policy around income taxation, which affects consumer demand, corporate taxation, what kind of energy support is going in. There's been an awful lot of changes in that, which makes the planning environment for SMEs very, very difficult. For the larger companies, they bear the strain as well in all of that, but they tend to have more resources, and the resources that are around the diversity and the inclusion agenda are really there around a growth agenda. I mean, I've always felt that the whole inclusion agenda is actually, it's about finding talent, it's making your business better. So I don't see any step back away from that. I've certainly not seen it yet. I can't say that it won't happen, but I actually think that that's now quite well embedded structurally in most large companies. Maybe not always at the pace we would like, but the mechanisms are there, and I think that's important. It's not just the words, it's what are the structures and the mechanisms and the processes that underpin it, and they're much more embedded now than they were.
I want to come back to that, just because of the vibe we're picking up from CEOs about how they're prioritizing sustainability, diversity, inclusion. But I first want to ask a question about who gets left behind in global markets. So some emerging markets were early to tighten and to put in place policies that allowed them to get a grip on inflation. But the question is, they can't afford to stop raising rates while the Fed continues itself to hike. So the question is, what does that mean for an already wide gap between rich nations versus poor ones?
It's actually quite a difficult topic to generalize on, I think, because I find it's interesting that the mood in Asia, for example, when you're there on the ground, is more buoyant than certainly the mood is in Europe, and actually even than it is in the UK. So despite the fact that there are exactly the strains that you articulate there, they're a little bit further away from some of the more existential things that are really top of mind. Like the energy situation, for example. It's not necessarily having quite the same impact. Quite often they're not dealing with the same levels of inflation, for example. So the dynamic is slightly different. I think the equality gap for some of certainly the very poor nations is problematic, and it's one of the things, and maybe we'll get onto this if we've got time, but it's one of the things that we really need to think about, not just sort of in short term in terms of what is the strength of dollar doing and the sort of second order effects of that around the world, but actually if we don't get the transition right, we are going to exacerbate the existing inequalities because of where the dependencies are, and the dependencies on things like coal, because it's the cheap local fuel. So I think it's quite complex to try and disaggregate what is the macro effect and the market effect, which is probably quite a short-term effect of withdrawing liquidity and then dollar strength, versus this longer-term thing. We've got to make it a just transition, and we don't yet have all the mechanisms in place that are going to enable that to happen. So we've really got to turn our mind and our attention to that, and there are things that we can do in that. So I think we are at a risk point, but I think there are also some positives that we can see coming from when you're not quite in the eye of the European storm.
Interesting. Okay, so I do have a dollar question in here somewhere, but I just want to remind the audience that if you have questions in the meantime, to please ask them, and we can triage there. But I guess the other question is, speaking of emerging markets, I want to come back to the UK. Because with the UK showing characteristics of an emerging market, how does that impact your allocations? And specifically, the question from one of our very smart markets editors is, are you treating the UK in your portfolios as an emerging market or developed one?
Well,
it's a true question.
I must say there were moments in the last 3-4 weeks when we were looking at some of the moves in some of the bond prices when you had to think, not completely daft question. However, I think that brief dabble and experimentation in the, let's just call it the less orthodox economic experiment, has demonstrated why it wasn't certainly executed in the way that it should have been. So no, the UK is not being treated like an emerging market. It's a big, broad-based market. Hopefully some stability has come back into things now, but it does have some challenges. It's also got some opportunities, and it needs to get real about how it tries to work to take advantage of those.
So here's a question coming in from Serge Ramin. Institutions in Europe tend to focus more on environment in their allocation decisions. What diversity-focused investment allocations are you prepared to support at this stage? What is missing to support higher allocations?
So it's a really interesting question. It's always worth reminding, when you're an asset manager, when you're in what we do is we look after other people's money. And we've seen massive demand from European institutions in particular. I include the UK in that. And we're seeing increasing demand from Asian investors, specifically for sustainability and climate-related strategies. It is fair today to say that the specific and narrow focus on just D&I has not been something that we have seen our clients explicitly ask for. So they do look for it, and they do test us on D&I as part of broader sustainability strategies, broader ESG strategies, but as dedicated strategies. The demand hasn't been there to anything like the same extent, and and maybe that's something that will grow over time. But that is the reality. That is the reality today. It's really seen as part of that. If you're a responsible investor, it's something that you should consider along with, rather than specifically D&I focused strategies.
Okay, so I'm going to skip ahead in my list and focus in a little bit on that. Just the idea that everyone is distracted. We and others have written about the fact that CEOs have said that they're either going to put on hold or push back initiatives, specifically around ESG sustainability, and because they're basically trying to insulate their businesses from recession. That is the focus right now. So the other stuff potentially gets put to the back burner. I guess generally when you're talking to CEOs, are you picking up on that? And what is the reality of some of these initiatives that got started really definitively getting pushed back?
Well, we're definitely not seeing, things being ripped up and thrown out, kind of whole strategies, whole sustainability strategies thrown out the window and whatever. So I definitely wouldn't say that's the case. It is true that if you're running a business right now and you are seeing massive hike in raw material prices, massive hike in energy prices, wage costs rising as well, and consumers beginning to feel a bit of pain and you're seeing that coming through on your top line, your customers are suffering as well. You're seeing your profits getting squeezed. You have a duty and your responsibility to the company, to the employees, to your customers, to your other stakeholders. You do have a responsibility to make sure that the business is robust enough to survive. And in that environment, management teams do have to make tough choices. And that is not necessarily to say that that means everything sustainably related has to come off the agenda. It absolutely should not, and I think absolutely will not. What it does mean is that there sometimes has to be some pragmatism about how you phase and how you time, how you put your effort and your emphasis on the things that really matter and will make a difference, and how maybe you stretch out the kind of pipeline, the investment that you put into some of the stuffs, which maybe don't have an impact today or tomorrow, and maybe are things that you can pull the time out a little bit because they kind of have a longer impact down the ground. And I think that kind of resequencing, I'm sure we will see a little bit of that, and companies have to do that because they do have a duty to make sure that they carry on, that they are actually sustainable in themselves, because if they don't, the impact on jobs, the impact on communities, if they fail, is huge. So it is a difficult time for management. What I take some encouragement from, and this is true on your earlier question on D&I, as it is on quite a lot of the things that surround the sustainability agenda, is that if you focus on embedding the structures, the processes, the policies, right down in the grassroots of the business, and you get those to be self-sustaining so that they are just part of your business decisions, so that if you're making an investment decision, you have embedded in it what are the sustainability consequences of that. So you embed that in the investment decision. You as a CEO, once you've embedded that, you don't necessarily have to have it top of your mind anymore because you've really rooted it down in the organisation. No CEO can take every decision, nor should they. So if you embed the structures, that will actually, over time, leave you time for the organisation just to move that forward. It's like the power of the hive, and you can focus on what you need to do to make sure that your business can navigate through these very difficult environments. So I think the corporate world responded to the challenges sort of 2-3 years ago and has really pushed, not every company, not every sector to the same extent, but has really pushed hard and fast into thinking and how you progress some of these quite important things, and probably moved faster than governments in actual practical things. That's quite embedded. I don't believe that will change. I think that will carry on. But maybe some of the emphasis in the shorter term is actually how are we just going to get through this particularly difficult set of economic circumstances.
Fair enough. And I want to prime everyone to get their phones out because I'm going to go to an audience question in just a second. But I'm going to ask Anne one question before that, so get ready. But it's about risk and the idea that there is risk to the investor and then there's risk to the world, and that as an investor, you should account for both. And my question is, as a manager of money at a time when portfolios are being squeezed, how difficult is that to balance the two?
So we've tried, that's a kind of double materiality.
I just was trying not to use that phrase.
Okay, I blew that one, yeah, a double materiality. Our fundamental view is that eventually the kind of broader impact risk becomes a financial risk. And the way that I would sort of describe this, and I think the insurance sector is really, really good at thinking this. I think many other sectors find thinking this long term hard. The insurance sector is kind of set up to think about tail risks and think about events which they cannot predict will happen this year or next year, but they can see that might happen over a period of time. And they look at their great data hounds. The insurance sector picks up the data. It can see what the climate, it can see when the storm damage is rising. It can see what the impact of extreme weather events is, to take a very obvious example. And as a consequence of that, the insurance sector is very good at pricing for tail risk, much better than most other sectors are. And it's important because if you only solve for the short term, and if you think that the tail risk is quite unlikely to happen on your 3-year view, and you always run your business for the 3-year view, when the tail risk eventually hits, you're maximizing profit, for example, over your series of short terms does not add up to what the total hit is over the long term when that event eventually hits. I'm not sure I've explained that quite as clearly as it sits in my head. But basically, the long term is not always a sum of the series of short terms. The maximum profit over the long term and the sum of the short-term profit maximization can give you a different answer. Other sectors find that harder. So what we try and do in our analysis is we try and bring that forward-looking view is what is the long-term consequence likely to be of the environmental damage, of not decarbonising, of higher temperatures, and how that will affect different sectors in different ways, and try and bring that thinking right back to the present day, because we think the double materiality are both ultimately financial risks, but the time horizon of them can be different. So we need to get better about thinking about the time horizon. And this is one of where the gyrations in the bond market are actually unhelpful, because as the discount rate goes up, it effectively diminishes the impact of the tail, and the tail is really important on this. So, you know, I think that it's something that, from a financial analysis point of view, we need to get richer in our conversations around about it. A lot of the impact is financial. It's just not financial yet.
So your view is that most companies need to change their modeling so that they can sort of mirror a little bit what insurers are doing in terms of like the back end.
And I think you're seeing that. I think you're seeing that in the climate stress scenarios that the banks use, for example. I think you're seeing that as people try and think of multi-year projects in, you know, the materials sector or the energy sector. People are trying to think more broadly and more holistically about that. But, you know, it's a new skill, and we're all learning about it. And I think the accounting standards, which take into consideration the sustainability impact, I think will help that. It will give us a common language, a common terminology, some common ways of trying to capture that.
Okay. Now it's time for our audience poll. Everybody get ready. I want to ask the question to the audience of what you think companies, including your own, and remember this is anonymous, so be honest, are doing in terms of, are CEOs, including your own, pausing? And this question is focused on equity initiatives as opposed to sustainability broadly. Here we are, Quality Summit. Do you think they're pausing equity initiatives because they're more preoccupied with the challenges of a shrinking economy? Yes, no, or I'm not sure. Let's give it a second for the results to come in.
I can't remember which order they came in.
Yeah, that's good. So it was,
no,
yeah.
yes, no.
No, they are not. Oh, sorry. Or pausing. No, they are not pausing. Okay. Okay, so, it's still coming in. It's a little bit neck and neck, right?
Oh no, come on.
All right.
So half and half, basically.
So roughly half. Okay,
Yeah.
let's call it. Let's just say half are pausing, the others are continuing to go. Okay. Well, either way, I think, you know, that begs the question of accountability. And one place where the accountability might fall is on the workforce itself. And so the question is, do you see the next wave of accountability on CEOs to push for just and fair measures, whether it's climate, diversity and inclusion, will come from employees themselves, keeping in mind that a lot of CEOs say the biggest demand for change is coming from employees and new hires, which kind of answers the question. But what do you think?
Well, it's, you know, every country in the world, it's a really tight labour market right now. I mean, you know, it is a quite extraordinary set of conditions. You know, as we've come out of the pandemic, there is no country in the world that doesn't feel it has some sort of labour shortage, and therefore, the hunt for talent is difficult. And so the focus of companies on both hiring and retaining talent, I think, is as great as it has ever been. And so because of that, I actually think it's quite a catalyst for companies to be more imaginative about the way they do their hiring and the pools that they seek. So I'm not sure how much is demand-led from the talent side, although I think it's part of it. But I also think it's a kind of part of the competitive race, if you like, that every CEO has to deal with. We definitely see with a younger cohort that they are very specific about what it is that they want. And we have some that absolutely want to be in a fully office-based environment, for example. They did their university degrees or college degrees sitting in their bedrooms. They want to be in an office with other people that they can go out for a drink with after work or whatever it might be. We have some who say, actually, I'm on a different gig to that. I never want to go into an office. I never want to wear a suit. So we've got others who are quite a different, and the expectation and the demands of what they want. The younger cohorts are definitely much less shy about saying precisely what they want. So I think there is some of the demand side on that. But Well, certainly in our business, we saw, as I'm sure many of your companies would have seen as well, in general, our attrition rates remain below industry averages. In technology, nonetheless, we saw quite a spike. And so we've had to get really imaginative about where we go looking for talent in that. And we're using very different ways of recruiting. So we're deliberately recruiting people who've not previously had coding experience, for example. We put them through our own training program. We use CV-less hiring processes. We're going out and we're partnering with not-for-profit organizations and other organizations who are looking into different talent pools. And we are not the only company doing that. So, I think there's still that war for talent, which will keep this quite top of mind and top of agenda.
Right. And then there's accountability to the investor, but I feel like I should ask, take one more question from the audience. The banking question or the supplier diversity ratio question? Let's go to the shortest one. Sorry. Sorry, Serge. Ada Jabaru asks, how are you ensuring a fair supplier diversity ratio, specifically around ethnic diversity?
Okay, so that's quite a specific question, and I'm not sure I'm necessarily the best to answer the kind of detail points on that, but we have a supplier policy whereby we look at what the diversity of our suppliers are, and we look to make sure that our suppliers, to the best extent that we can, have policies and aspirations that align to our own around the D&I agenda. And that is the kind of overarching thing that we try and do. So we try and encourage that diversity to come through, and that's the basic way that we address that.
Okay. My second question on the accountability piece, comes in the form of the investor themselves in the investment space. Given the number of, regulations and disclosures, that's not going away. So you've got the employee piece, which you spoke to, and then there's the investor piece. And so it's actually a specific question, but is Fidelity having to be more specific in its messaging when selling funds tied to sustainability, ESG, given the focus by regulators on potential mis-selling?
Well, we've all been working in this very, sorry, I'm just going to have a quick slug of water here, on this very evolving landscape when it comes to what are the rules. And this is a whole space that has moved at pace. And I think when we started down the sustainability journey, the message was definitely let's go for pace over perfection. And I think that was probably true across the industry. The rules have got more prescriptive, particularly in Europe, and some of the taxonomies and some of the detail within that have got really quite complex. And as a consequence of that, as a consequence of the rules emerging, firms are quite legitimately looking at what they aspire to do, looking at what the rules are saying, and then testing to make sure that what they originally set out to do and what the rules are now saying actually align. And we have seen, and I think it is a good thing to do, some funds that initially were hoped to be, not at Fidelity, but elsewhere, Article 9 now rebadging themselves as Article 8 because they felt they could no longer meet what is now a clearer set of standards. The prescriptiveness is really very, very finely detailed and quite difficult. And the more that we have different regimes popping up in different countries, the harder it will be for asset managers to respond to that. The view that we've tried to take is to try and make sure that in both spirit and in letter, we are aligning what we are doing with all of the taxonomies, and that is the best way that we can try and ensure that we are where we need to be. But it is a rapidly evolving place. I think what none of us like in the industry is where marketing hype and actual reality are divorced, and I think there have been some cases of that. I think most of the serious firms that we work with are genuinely trying to do the right thing in a very rapidly evolving space. And the other thing, which is a tightrope that we all walk, is that some things do come down to a matter of judgment. And it's a bit like with the transition. There are some who believe fervently we should divest from all fossil fuels today and hang the consequences because that's the only thing that will happen to get us to where we need to be in 2050. There are others that say, going back to one of your earlier questions on and equality and equity is if you do that, the pain will be felt hardest amongst those least able to cope in the emerging world, typically because of the thermal coal exposure. Therefore, it's very often, it's not the end point that we're in debate here, it's how we transition from today to the end point. And we have to keep talking and evolving and iterating. Do we have to use, a less brown but still not green, gas being an example, as a route to getting greener ultimately? How do we create that? What's the right way to go about that? Energy security does matter. If you don't have energy security, again, the impact on the least able to cope is very high. So these are complex issues, and sometimes they get drilled down into sound bites, and that's not necessarily helpful or productive.
So we have a couple more minutes, and I just have two final questions. I looked on your website at your leadership bench, and I just wanted to ask, as a CEO of a major global company, are you satisfied with your own track record building a diverse leadership bench? And what would you change? We all have something to aspire towards. What would you change?
I'd like to sort of speed up the clock, really. When we started, and specifically talking about gender initially, when I came to Phil 4 years ago, we had 20-something% of our senior leaders were female. We got that up to sort of 30% by 2020, which was a target that we had set ourselves. We're now up to about 33%, and the next goal that we're aiming to hit by the end of 2024 is 35%. It needs training, it needs the right role experience, it needs the right talent pool. All of these things take time. I'm really pleased with what we've done. I would like us to be able to do it faster. But we don't just think about gender. I mean, one of the things that we introduced right in the middle of the pandemic was enhanced parental leave, because I really believe that we have to give not just women more opportunity and more freedom, we have to give men, we have to give secondary care. So we introduced our enhanced parental leave so that everybody can have the same amount of parental leave. It's really, really powerful. So we've tried to think about how we make it more equitable for everybody. It's not just one for one. We don't have time to do it, but on other diversity measures as well, we've really made some serious progress on ethnicity. We've gone through our initial target that we set ourselves, and we're still building on that. But there's a lot of work to do. I'd just like to speed up the clock, honestly. Right. That's what I'd like to do. But I do know I've been in this game a long time. It takes time.
Final question for me is about leadership. And, when you think of the next generation of leader and what he or she will need to have in the way of qualifications to succeed, how will the CEO of, 2050, say, differ from the CEO of 2020?
30 years, almost, in the future. I have no idea. But they will have...
Okay, let's shorten the gap, 2040.
But I mean, just think about it. I mean, the CEO of 2050 is likely somebody who's probably, just coming out of their teens or in their early 20s today, give or take. The experience of the pandemic has formed a generation that I think will stand out as a highly resilient generation. It's a generation that had to adapt to a major global event in a way that my generation didn't really. Maybe the generation that went through the Second World War did, maybe the Great War. But, it's a global event on a scale that we've not really seen before. And I think that will have shaped them in their resilience and in their adaptability. And from what I see a CEO needs today, resilience and adaptability are right up there. The final thing that I would add to that is empathy. I mean, I think it was the empathetic leaders that helped their organizations through the pandemic. Empathy is a superpower. I think you can learn empathy, but you have to switch your mind to that. But empathy, resilience, adaptability, I think that's what you need.
Okay, and on that note, and thank you very much, Anne.
Okay, thank you very much.
Please welcome Eric Collins, CEO and founding partner, ImpactX Capital Partners, Charmaine Hayden, founding partner, Good Soil VC, Sharmadine Reed, founder and CEO, The Stack World, and Bloomberg's Olivia Konate-Ahulu.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for being here. We've got three very, very impressive people with me today, and I'm really looking forward to having a chat. We've already been talking a bit about some of the issues. And just to kind of dive straight in, all of you have talked extensively and worked extensively in the area of access to capital and equity in entrepreneurship for quite some time. You've been talking about this for quite some time. And maybe just working down, looking at the positives, where do you think that there has been progress? Eric?
So, thank you for having me, and I think it's a very important topic. I think the biggest piece of progress has probably been in attention focused on the idea of investing in Black women. Now, there's a difference between the idea of investing in Black women and the reality of investing in Black women. If you think about asset allocators, are asset allocators actually saying to fund managers, I refuse to put money behind you unless I see the following happen, that there are actually Black women who are part of your portfolio? Are we seeing that fund managers are saying that what we're going to do is we're going to make sure that we have on our team, so that we expand our networks, the various individuals who are actually investing professionals and who have the ability to actually invest capital, that we have on our team actually Black women who can then do certain things. So from my perspective, there's certainly been a lot of good lip service. I'm not confident that that has then translated to the actions by asset managers and the action by fund managers to actually get sufficient capital. And because of that, we still have those numbers that you see in the United States. You know, we're still missing $1 trillion of opportunity because there's an underinvestment in Black businesses. In the UK, it's $75 billion. We are underinvesting, and that is not being added to the GDP. So,
thank you. That's really helpful. And I think in the UK, like you were saying, there's very similar figures, like less than 0.25% of venture capital goes to Black business owners, which does seem like something to be addressed. And but do you feel like there's been progress in any particular areas from when you first started in this?
There's very small progress. Again, as Eric said, there's been a lot of lip service. I think a lot of the progress has actually come from very public companies who used investing into Black women as a marketing tool, specifically after the George Floyd incident. And then there was a lot of talking shop about what was going to be done or what could be done. But we haven't seen as much progress as we would like. The good things that have come out of it are, for example, SoftBank's Future Fund was supposed to be, I guess, a lip service, I believe, but actually saw results. And because of the results that were seen, actually turned into an evergreen fund. We're yet to see the deployment, but there has been some progress somewhat. And the fact of the matter is we're often having to spout US figures because in the UK, our data sources are so small because the numbers are even more dire, sadly. So the good thing is where we do have some success stories, we do have some Sharmadines, to be able to spout and be able to say, actually, these are capable, talented individuals that we can invest in, and this is why you should invest in us so that we can then invest in these individuals. But I guess the progress is slower than the snail's pace, sadly, but incremental growth, I guess.
How about you, Sharmadine? How hopeful are you?
Hopeful would be the wrong word. I actually don't think there's been any progress. The numbers for venture capital to women have actually gone backwards. We're down 26%. It's now 2% of women have actually raised VC. So if you look at all of the charts, the funding for women peaked in 2018. There were some big rounds with like Glossier, etc. And now they've gone down and they continue to go down post-pandemic. And while I think the pandemic was definitely, an accelerator, I actually think it was going down anyway. As Charmaine said, I raised VC 4 years ago, right? So 4 years, I was one of the first Black women to raise VC in the UK. There are only 38 Black people, I believe, according to Extend Ventures, who've raised VC. So for me to have raised around 4 years ago, imagine if that was the average white male, that the one raised 4 years ago and you didn't have any more. Like, that would be a bizarre, right? That would be bizarro. So I actually think progress is going backwards. And the lip service thing I agree with, but what actually just needs to happen is more room for Black women to experiment with capital in the same way that white founders are given that opportunity.
And something else that we've touched on is, so the general conclusion seems to be that progress, where it has been there, has been more about lip service, and in terms of concrete progress, it's been pretty thin on the ground. And we're also, of course, entering into a pretty interesting time economically and financially in the general context of the UK. What do you think that potentially has that could potentially do for kind of minority entrepreneurs going forwards right now? Eric?
Well, it's interesting, right? Because you have a dynamic that we haven't seen before. We actually have bargains here in the UK. And when we look at our portfolio, so ImpactX invests in underrepresented entrepreneurs in the UK and Europe. We look specifically at digital technology, health education, lifestyle, media and entertainment, places where women and people of color over-index across Europe and the UK. When we're looking at these particular populations and businesses are being built that are absolutely sensational businesses, what we do find is because the pound relative to the dollar has actually seen a bit of a sink, we're seeing these bargains that are available, and suddenly we're finding American companies that really want to take out organizations in our portfolio. We've got 25 companies in our portfolio. I think 4 of them are currently in conversations about being acquired. So the issue of actually getting exits, which is something that is absolutely imperative for these entrepreneurs. So Sharmadine needs an exit to prove that the next time that she's trying to start a business, because Sharmadine will, eventually run the world, that when she is doing that, there will be a number of people who want to come behind her because she's actually had a good exit. So these exits are absolutely useful. However, we're finding, just like everyone else who has a portfolio of assets, that these assets that are your most valuable assets, there are ways in which they're sniffing around to see whether or not we can actually get them out of the market, get them into our organization. Particularly the M&A activity is extreme at the moment. I'm glad to see that that is actually happening, and that's something which is relatively new for Black entrepreneurs here in the UK and in Europe. But it does worry me that we are going to be not getting these organizations to their full potential, but it is the nature of venture.
I would say even pre it being a bargain, a lot of minority founders within my communities were already looking to America for their next rounds anyway, which is a very, very bad look for British capital, right? The reasons will be culturally, there are more Black people in the US, so we feel like actually there are more high net worth individuals, there are more Black VCs, there are more Black people with wealth in the US that you can both aspire to, but that can also write those angel checks, which are actually key when you're starting out in those early days. So I think that culturally, a lot of people are looking to America to be like, actually here it's going to be a lot easier to raise money. They're a lot less risk averse than we are in the UK. And actually I've got instant scale if I crack the US. So I think for me, I love England, love London. I don't want to feel that I have to leave my country to find capital. I want to be able to reinvest back in the UK, reinvest back in London, and also hire people from the UK and give them work and employment.
And I think if we touch on what Sharmadine just said, if people are having to leave the country in order to seek capital, likely domicile elsewhere, knowing that even the British Business Bank said that it's likely that we're going to be leaning very heavily on SMEs, knowing that Black people are actually, Black women specifically, are the fastest growing group of small business owners in the world, then what does that mean for our economy? Knowing that we will no longer domicile here, raise here, employ here, and then have our successes and exits here, what does that mean for the general economy? And I think when we're looking at the effects of the current economic crisis that is looming or here, we also need to think about the fact that there was already an issue with raising capital for Black founders. This will be definitely increased, and even where people are raising, where founders are raising, the down rounds that everybody is facing are going to be substantially lean heavier on those Black faces because of the social nuances that people don't really realise are taking place. So sometimes it's language, it's the way people present, it's just about a skin colour, it's making people actually say, actually, maybe you're not capable. So we feel like you should price your round down, which means that you should be getting a worse deal than you should really be getting, based on what you look like or how you speak or how you present. And I think that those things are kind of really devastating effects, because it does mean that we're going to have a far worse economic crisis than we potentially could have, because those people will exit, will go to the States to where they feel welcome.
So thinking about what we can do in the UK and potential solutions, we've actually got a poll here which I think people can contribute to. So It's saying for Black aspiring entrepreneurs, what would be most helpful for starting up a business? And yes, you can, people in the audience and I think online can answer that. And one thing which, which I think comes up a lot is the potential of being over-mentored and underfunded is something which comes up all the time. So,
and that's actually, Olivia, I'm looking at these answers in A, B, C. I'm just like, okay, really? What we're talking about is mentorship, which is at the bottom of the pile in terms of people coming to organizations, very far from being in decision-making positions. Venture capital and angel investors is sort of looking at people who are actually getting assets which have already been allocated by asset allocators. I'm sort of very curious about these as the potential answers. I really do believe the big answer to the question is that we need to spend more time with asset allocators, and asset allocators need to use their soft and hard power to say that there are things that we wish to see, and there are reasons why that is not simply a feel-good initiative, but it's a manner in which we can actually return capital in a fiduciarily responsible fashion. So, I'm glad that people are going to be answering this question, but I think that the question is wrong. So just to let you know that, just to let you know.
Okay, we'll keep that in mind, thank you. And so going from that, would you say that targets are the best way going forwards for asset allocators?
Ooh.
No.
You know, I was a person who, I agree with Ursula Burns, who's the vice chair of my advisory board. I agree with her that at one point I did not really believe in this idea of making sure that there were quotas. But at this point, we have tried everything else. We must have real targets. If we do not have these targets, it does not appear that organizations are willing to actually put in the work, even though the data shows us that by putting in the work and making the investments, you actually do get better returns. I mean, we've seen this through the Kauffman Foundation. We've seen this actually through McKinsey. It's been studied time and time again in terms of what is the premium that happens at exit and what is the amount of capital that's actually raised, which is increased if you have these diverse teams, particularly teams with women and people of color. All of that is proven. So the question as to why it is that we how do we actually have a method to ensure that we actually get capital into the hands of the people who can then make these contributions to the economy is something that might have to be legislated through quotas, targets, whatever we want to call it. I'm ready for it. I'm ready for it.
Okay.
And leaning on that, I would definitely say mandates, specifically knowing that the LPs, the asset allocators that invest into funds, etc., are generally, a lot of them are public funds, right? And if we're educating the public and putting a mandate in place that they let them know where their money, your pension fund is going, and they understand that this pension fund is not being invested in the best fiduciary interests of myself and also doesn't reflect me and my community, how does that affect the way that people will invest? Knowing that people will actually call them to account. Because the majority of people don't even understand that their funds are being invested elsewhere, let alone where they're going and how they're distributed and what that means for the wider economy. So I think that, as well as the current things that we've discussed, is something that we could actually really put out there.
Definitely, thank you. And yeah, I don't know what you think about quotas and if that's potentially a way forward or not.
I think I agree with, excuse me, what's been said on the panel. I would say that it's not always about the first touch point. So I feel like with a quota, you get the first touch point. There has been, you know, in the last decade, an increase from a baseline of 0 of more people being funded. However, what happens after you get the money is quite important, which is that typically Black founders don't have the same networks and access to power that other founders might have. So what you'll get is a whole bunch of people raising at seed. But if you know anything about VC, you really need to get to your chasm, cross that chasm and get to Series A. Because once you've gotten to Series A, there's a huge increase in likelihood that you're going to have an exit. So I would say that while I managed to get capital, what I found really difficult were those networks. Believe it or not, I come from a creative background. I went to art school. I didn't know what a consultant was when I started. When I started a startup, I was like, wow, there's all these people, and they're in all of the startups. All of the, they went to the same universities and the same schools, etc. So I do think that while the quotas are important, what everyone in the room can actually do is think about network and how you bring Black founders into your network and make the right introductions to them for customers, suppliers, funding, etc. Because actually that is more valuable post-seed than just giving another check.
And actually, kind of leaning on that, because it's really helpful hearing about your own experience with you as well, with both of you. Were there any particular things which you found really helpful when you were kind of in the starting stages of building your businesses?
Are you speaking about when we was raising our fund? Or? Yeah. Okay. So I guess in starting the fund, I do say that everybody was pretty helpful. I called probably about 2,000 VCs. I, like Sharmadine, didn't have a background in tech. I had built a diverse modelling agency and not financial modelling, I have to say. So this is a complete, you have to, because people start spouting numbers at me and it gets like, hey. So it's really important to know that building from the ground up, it is really about those networks. It's about, I literally called like, who you're investing in, why you're investing in, what segments, which geographies, why, how, and it was generally a bit of a nuisance probably, but people were forgiving. And I think that when we look at that as in general, we realise how much we all have to offer. Most of us are going about our roles and thinking that we can't change anything, right? But we built a village of mentors for the startups that we invest in, from company-wide, so from the CEOs to the COOs, all the way down to the first employees, to say, actually, what were your experiences? What helped you to keep on board? Everybody plays a role. So when you're starting a business, you may be a great creative, you may be really analytical, you may be a great dev, but you also need those teams and you need those networks. So those things are things that we can all think about in terms of how we can apply human capital as well as financial capital.
Thank you. So is that fair to say that mentorship does play some kind of
I think
role?
mentorship, as long as there is capital that flows as well, I think that we need to make sure that these founders are getting the money and the impetus of support that they need. But most importantly, they need the money to be able to have the runway, to be able to employ those people once you advise them on what they need to be doing. And then they need to be able to leverage future or networks in order to be able to get that secondary capital, because their runway extension is going to be necessary. And at some stage it becomes, I just need to not die, right? As a founder, I need to not die. I need my startup to continue in order to make sure that these stats don't say that this company failed because it was a terrible founder. They fell because there was no continuation of funding, and then that data feeds back. So when we're going to our fund allocators and saying, "Hey, invest in our funds because we can deliver on great startups," there aren't those cross questions as to why these startups are no longer in existence.
So financial and social capital working together. Basically.
Can I say something on mentorship? You know, what we do at the Stack World is we power communities and internal networks. And the problem with mentorship is it's one-to-one. It is a one-to-one interaction that doesn't actually expand your network unless there are active steps to expand your network. Anyone who's studied network science or even just virology, now that we're all really familiar, knows that you need to have multiple touch points to expand your network, which then expands your power base, which then extends your ability to raise capital. What I would say is, rather than just think about mentorship or I would like to mentor someone, which is quite formal and transactional, I would say think about friendships and think about your community. Like, how many Black people do you have in your friend network is what I always say to people. Do you have any Black friends? Like, think about that, what that actually means, because how much more likely are you to introduce someone to someone who's going to help a friend versus just a mentee, which, you know, as I said, I believe is transactional. I think we can all really think about how we shape the world we live in by how we create our judgments and biases and tastes based on who we have in our network. Right now, in a hybrid work environment and in a post-pandemic work environment, the lines between work and home are consistently blurring. And I actually think that the lines between work colleagues and friendships are also blurring. And I truly believe that for this to change, it can't just be, oh, meet my mentee, which sounds a bit like poor me. Like, do you know what I mean? It's more like, I've got this incredible friend who's working on this. You really should check them out. That's always going to land way harder than being like my mentee.
So you're presenting each other on more of an equal footing.
On equal footing, exactly.
Yeah, I wonder what you were thinking, Eric, when in terms of firstly your own career and starting out, and what kind of helped you, and also, I guess, the difference between mentorship and maybe networking.
So I think about this issue just a bit, and in fact, I've written about it in this book. We Don't Need Permission. The reason I've written about it is because I think we over-rely on mentors. And mentors are, I love all that you all have said because there's this one-to-one relationship. It actually has a possibility of introducing you to bigger networks. But what I found, especially in terms of fundraising, and this is what we do. We spend all of our time fundraising, all three of us, right? When we're fundraising, the question is really less about, do I need someone to help me to become a better fundraiser, and I need more of a sponsor. Someone who is actually going to take a step and to put themselves at risk and to put me in front of the right sorts of people with the right type of introduction and the right sort of endorsement to get the next step done. And to actually do that in a way which reduces the cycle time from introduction to close and commitment. And so I get higher conversion rating. What I find very frequently is in the United States, when we are actually fundraising, and all of us talk about the United States as being a place to fundraise, I find that there is a closer set of relationships that actually do exist, and that the sponsorship is a bit more formalized. Here in the UK, I found it very challenging, whether we're talking about businesses, corporations, family offices, whether we're talking about foundations or endowments. I find all those organizations are very slow. And that indeed, if we're looking for innovation, even in terms of the activities that are associated with social impact investing, sort of diverse and emerging managers, we find so little leadership in Europe on these particular topics. Very little leadership. We find it from the United States. Maybe we should expect that because of Silicon Valley and the expectation in Boston and New York that there's lots of innovation that we export to the world. But I'm very sort of fascinated how few, whether they be mentors or whether they be sponsors, how few opportunities we actually have to actually convert into something that's tangible and helpful to us. I really don't, again, we started off talking about lip service. I don't need more conversation. We need action. And we need that action to be demonstrated by real support and real commitment and catalytic activity. And there's so little catalytic activity which is happening right now here in the UK and in Europe. And I'd like to call that out as being one of the major problems that I think all of us face as people of color, women, no matter what age we are. We find that to be a challenge, no matter how good our networks are.
Well, thank you for that call to action. I think we've got time for very quick rounds for all of you. So maybe ending on that note, what would all of you see? What's the kind of one lower hanging fruit, one action that you would like to see that you think could make kind of the biggest impact in this field? Maybe Shamadine.
I would like to see more people angel investing in black women. You know, doesn't matter how small the ticket is, could be £500, £5,000. But with that angel investment, you are putting more money into the black female economy, and effectively with an angel ticket usually comes relationships and the friendship that I mentioned earlier. So definitely write a check.
To the point, thank you.
Well, I love that. Definitely co-sign the write a check. And also, when reviewing specifically for asset managers investing in funds, looking beyond the typical. If we're looking at innovation, why are we not being innovative about the way we invest into emerging fund managers? For example, someone who doesn't speak the way you speak the language doesn't mean that they can't deliver. Someone who has invested smaller checks than they plan to doesn't mean that they can't invest larger checks. And then when we're looking at overall, if we look at the fact that because someone doesn't have a 12-year career history in finance doesn't mean they can't deliver. And that doesn't actually make sense because we already know that the figures for how many black women, for example, are already in the financial market in senior positions are so low. How does that hinder the barrier to entry? So definitely that, and yeah, invest in good soil VC, I guess, is the final word.
Absolutely. Invest in good soil, invest in Impact X.
Indeed.
And I would say that I am speaking specifically, Olivia, for me, to the asset allocators. I am concerned if you are a foundation, if you are a corporation, if you are a endowment, if you are a fund of funds. I am very curious as to how few of those organizations are LPs in funds. We still are relying upon small checks from high net worth individuals. This is how ImpactX got started. We actually have money that came from black people, and I'm completely serious, it's only black people on the West Coast and the East Coast of the United States, in the UK, and then in France. That is all the money that we received from those individuals who are easy allies and people who understand that there is return potential that's available and non-concessionary return potential in the top quartile. We've been able to prove that at ImpactX. We imagine that that then is the calling card. Isn't that the ideal calling card to then go to institutional investors and say, someone has already taken the risk? We are actually now in a position where we can say to you, with this risk having been taken, that you can look at our track record and other sorts of things as a team. It's time to step up. But you're going to have to do something catalytic. It can't be a small sort of a check that you really don't want to get back. We would like this to be part of your actual funds that are necessary in order to deliver your returns, those key pieces of returns that you need. And we find it, and I find it very interesting that there is so much timidity. I don't know where it's from, but that's other people's business. And maybe it's the liquidity problems because the public markets are down. We don't know you well enough, and we really don't socialize with you. So we're not friends. And so, Eric, it's hard to fund you, or it's hard to fund Charmaine, et cetera, et cetera. There are a whole number of reasons, I'm sure, that are very logical. And then when someone says them to me, I'm sure I'd say, aha, I get it. But I really think that we're talking about something a bit more insidious than that, and that what we need to do is to have asset allocators, as I said before, to use their hard and soft power to actually put money behind these theses so that we can actually stop talking about them theoretically and have them proven out factually. That's what needs to be done.
Thank you. I think it seems fair to sum up there. It comes down to money and being confident and putting it behind. We have run out of time, and I feel like we've just scratched the surface. But thank you so much for your time. Thanks so much to the audience. And
Please welcome Bloomberg's Laura Zelenko.
Representation matters in journalism. It matters who reports the story, who writes the story, who edits and shapes that story, and it matters greatly whose opinions and perspectives we are drawing on to decide what stories to tell and how to tell them. Diverse sourcing is how we help ensure we are fair, we are balanced, we are accurate, and we are complete in our coverage. Now, we, like many media organizations, have struggled a lot to get this right, to bring more women and other underrepresented experts into our coverage. And I think that this is actually even more difficult for a financial news organization like ourselves. I know I've been a journalist at Bloomberg for almost 30 years, most of that time leading coverage with big teams of journalists around the world. And more recently, I was given the opportunity to really focus on this representation issue as the global standards editor for Bloomberg. And as part of that, in 2018, I launched an initiative called New Voices. At that time, we looked at our representation on TV, and we found that only 10% of the external guests that we were bringing on TV at that time were women, and an even lower percentage of people in the United States were people of color. And we knew that we needed to do something urgent and actionable to address that. There are many reasons why journalists maybe have a hard time diversifying their sourcing. We're often on deadline. We go to the people that are easiest to reach, the people that we know. And for financial journalists dealing with a lot of the big banks, we're often pushed people to interview. We're pushed the same people over and over again. And if we have trouble finding women, sometimes the women don't want to go on. They don't feel like they've been trained. They don't feel like they have the support. So we felt like that we could do something more proactive and intentional and urgent. As part of the New Voices program, we sponsor intensive media training for senior women in financial institutions around the world, as well as cohorts of Black and Latinx executives of all gender identities in the United States. At this point, we have provided this intensive media training to more than 400 women in 13 cities around the world. I think we have a map here to show you. This year, we actually launched in Tokyo and Zurich for the first time. And we also, as part of this initiative, we have built a database of female experts in business and finance that's grown from 500 people in 2018 to more than 8,000 names today. And we've also developed tracking tools so that we can hold our managers accountable for change. I'm happy to say that since we started this program, we have more than tripled our representation of female guests on Bloomberg TV, and we keep pushing to go higher. We see the impact on our coverage. We have better conversations. We're breaking different stories. We're meeting people that we otherwise wouldn't have talked to. And what's been really interesting is that for the women themselves, we've seen a knock-on effect on their careers. Many of these women were really invisible to the financial media before, and now they're appearing on Bloomberg TV and many of our competitors' outlets as well. And they really are providing role models to the next generation, particularly for the firms that they are working for that themselves are reflecting on the diversity of their upper ranks. So they really are the definition of you cannot be what you cannot see. We're very thankful for all of the people that have gone through the program and providing and lending their expert opinions to our coverage. And we have two wonderful women here who took part in our program to come up on stage right now. Let me introduce Shamin Shoher-Power, Head of Inflation Trading at Bank of Ireland, and Nina Shkero, the CEO at the Center for Economics and Business Research in London. Thank you so much for joining us. We're going to talk now their expertise on the uneven impact of inflation on society and what are some of the solutions that we can look to tame it. So thanks for joining us. It's interesting just to point out before we start that both Nina and Shamin have experience with hyperinflation from their backgrounds, Shamin in Turkey and your family from former Yugoslavia. So just to keep that in mind, because we're going to be talking about the uneven inflation that we're seeing from both the developed world and the developing world. The Bloomberg forecast right now for inflation in the US is 8% for this year, the UK 9%. We see in Sweden 7.6%, South Africa 6.8%, and many of the emerging markets in double digits. So I first wanted to ask you both, what is your near and medium term outlook and where is it stickiest for inflation? Nina, do you want to start?
Yeah. Sure. I think in terms of sort of, broadly summarizing, sort of if we look at inflation in the US, in the UK, in the Eurozone, we are expecting sort of a near-term peak to come pretty soon in the next couple of months, and then for inflation to start gradually ticking down. But I think what's been a really interesting feature of our forecasts is that we're not expecting any of those sort of developed markets to see inflation back at their 2% target for quite a number of years. It's not really a question of months. Sort of looking into the late 2020s, we're still seeing inflation at, close to twice that 2% target. And I mean, there's a number of reasons for that. Even, some people are sort of looking at the energy crisis and saying, well, once that's out of the figures, then isn't inflation just going to go back down to that 2% target? And our view is, no, not really. If wages are sticky, there are sort of slightly different things happening in emerging markets in terms of access to less expensive labor and other inputs into supply chains. So I think there's a entire host of reasons to think inflation is going to be elevated for the foreseeable future in our view.
Yeah, I completely agree, actually. And I guess we are in a really unique period of time. We have just been through a pandemic, and now we have a war in the middle of Europe. So it's easy to think that there might be some cyclical elements which are dominant here, but I agree with you, Nina, that that's not the case. I mean, of course, throughout the pandemic, we've seen savings, spending patterns change. We obviously had massive shocks to commodity prices after the Russia-Ukraine conflict, but those impacts have already reached inflation, and that's why headline inflation is in double-digit levels even in Europe. But we are seeing that now stabilize. But what is worrying is we are actually still seeing the underlying inflation pressures accelerate in core inflation. And as you have mentioned, this is not cyclical inflation, this is structural inflation pressures, and we are seeing a change from globalization into deglobalization. We are having discussions on how to have resilient supply chains. We are transitioning into green energy sources, and these will all have inflationary impacts going forward. So I completely agree. It's hard to see inflation levels stabilize at central banks' 2% targets while these structural changes are taking place.
Do you see any of the emerging market countries doing policies that perhaps are smart examples at this point for tackling inflation?
I think On the commodity side, of course, there was a difference for countries which are energy producers, which will be impacted less. But for example, looking at Europe, we have seen how our energy sources were actually not diversified and how dependent, especially the manufacturing sector, was on the gas flow coming from Russia. So, but that's why we are seeing policy measures put in place in Europe. The Repower EU plan is incentivizing green investments. In US, we have seen the Inflation Reduction Act, which again incentivizes green investments. So there are measures being put in place, but I'm afraid with the high commodity prices, it did hurt emerging markets and developed markets.
I think in terms of immediate sort of policies that are going to have an immediate impact, Latin America is a good example of sort of somebody who didn't really get monetary policy differently than in the US and in Europe, but they started doing it a good year ahead of a lot of other bigger central banks. And some people say, well, they just got lucky on the timing. But I mean, you know, what's luck and what's just a good decision. But I think, again, that's something that's on the very sort of, you know, immediate side. And then Shaman has said, I think in terms of the longer term, I think both developed and emerging markets are sort of in a similar boat in terms of facing upward price pressures.
I guess the one difference is obviously in developed markets, there's much bigger fiscal policy space, which can be put to work to support the consumers, to support industries. In emerging markets, that fiscal space is much smaller, so it's harder to offset the impact by introducing energy price caps or fiscal supports.
We actually already have some questions here, so I hate to not take advantage of that. Do you expect corporate earnings to shrink or continue to expand in the face of stubborn inflation? And how can the two coexist? Any thoughts there?
I guess as part of the deglobalization discussion we were having, so probably it's a good place to start with globalization. So during the last kind of 40 years, we were seeing the cheaper emerging market labor force integrate itself to developed market labor force. And kind of we've seen manufacturing jobs move to China. We've seen Eastern European impact, lower production costs in Germany. So, and this was a really difficult period for the workers to push for higher compensation. So on the corporate profit side, we've already seen a major shift from the labor income to corporate profits. So I guess as we are seeing a bit of a reversal now with deglobalization, we are actually already seeing super tight labor markets in the US, in Europe, and as we are discussing more of the reshoring of production facilities to developed markets, that market's going to tighten even more. We are expecting labor costs to increase, and obviously that will be negative for corporate profits.
I just want to turn to the UK for a second. There's lots of ways that we can talk about the UK, but there was an interesting quote that we had yesterday after the reversal of the tax cut policies, and the quote was, "This will be a hammer blow for many who were already worried how they will survive." That came from the Director General of the British Chambers of Commerce. What is your reaction to that?
It's obviously been a trying time in the UK. I think the one worry at the moment is that sort of it's hard to sort of agree or disagree with the direction of government's fiscal policy because there's a lack of clarity of what's actually happening. So, you know, we had the mini budget. Now 90% of that has been clawed back. I still think that the energy price cap, even though it's going to be reviewed in the more short term than initially anticipated, is going to help quite a lot of people. But then on the other hand, some policies that were labeled as helping only, you know, the wealthiest in society were actually, you know, for example, you've just mentioned the reversal of the base rate of income taxation. We're actually going to have a wider impact. So I'm going to be very curious to see what's coming from the new chancellor in the coming weeks. But I think one problem is now that any sort of expansionary policy and any sort of fiscal looseness has sort of been made radioactive by the reaction of the markets and the political turmoil. So I suspect there will be a lot more reluctance to act in that direction. So I wouldn't be surprised if some people face more hardship than they would have otherwise.
I would probably add, on the policy design side, probably the best way to tackle the issue would be to introduce measures in a means-tested way, which would actually support the most vulnerable in the society against energy price increases, while also introducing the message that we should be focusing on energy conservation, because we have very little. We have filled our storage in Europe to a large extent, but especially after the sabotage on the Nord Stream gas pipes, we are not actually able to add to those storage levels. So we have to make it clear that we should be all focused on conserving energy, because otherwise what we will end up will be blackouts, or most likely even sharper slowdown on the growth side if we are forcing manufacturers to actually cut production because we don't have enough energy to supply for them. So probably there should be a dual message here.
I want to go to our polling question now, just because I think we're very curious to see how the audience reacts to this. Do you believe the next generation will be better off than yourselves? Very simple, yes or no? Let's give it a second. Okay. I think there's a pretty steady no there. So let's talk about the intergenerational wealth gap and just sort of how do you maintain social cohesion and fight inflation simultaneously? What are some of the policy suggestions there?
I think our recent experience after the global financial crisis tells us that when the reaction to tackle was by austerity measures, then we practically had a lost decade, and it was particularly harder for the younger generations, with the youth unemployment levels increasing and staying high for a long period of time. And we have seen how that actually created resentment and how it has polarized the political scene, so that extreme right-wing and extreme left-wing parties would actually join the mainstream. And I think now I would say probably the focus needs to shift from maximizing shareholder profits to bringing communities and supporting individuals and making sure that everybody has access to social mobility, to certain level of free education, free healthcare, minimum wage, unemployment benefits, pensions, so that we can actually serve the whole of the society. And again, I think when we look at the younger generation, our generation thinks, okay, we have our full-time jobs, we have our pensions, we have our benefits, but actually that's not necessarily the experience of the younger generation. I mean, we have a two-tier labor market at the moment, and for new joiners, a lot of them end up with zero-hour contracts, part-time jobs. They don't necessarily have pensions or unemployment benefits. So there's a significant difference. So I think we need to tackle going forward to have better social cohesion and to bring the rest of society rather than focusing on it.
And it's interesting coming from an inflation trader saying that. Okay, Nina, what are your thoughts on that?
I think there isn't going to be a single sort of silver bullet solution to tackling inequality. If I had to pick out sort of three areas that I think are of a particular importance, one is access to high quality and free education. So, making sure that schools that are free to attend sort of across the countries, both sort of in urban, rural areas, are of the highest quality, and that there isn't sort of, because I think once you sort of get to that point of unequal education access or quality of education access, it's very hard to catch up later on. I think another area of focus is in terms of taxation. Most of the developed world is focusing very heavily on taxing income. And over a longer term, I think a shift towards what's a better method of taxation that focuses on wealth In a lot of countries, I think some reform around inheritance taxation is in the longer term going to be beneficial for inequality. And something that I think has become more relevant since the pandemic is I think there has been a little bit of a decoupling in terms of sort of access to jobs and your physical location with more flexible working. And I think there is some potential there for people who couldn't perhaps afford to preemptively move to very expensive urban areas and take what are usually the highest paying jobs are going to have a little bit of an easier entry. And I think that's something that's important not to lose out on and to continue to nurturing even as sort of things normalize post-COVID.
And can I, one last
word,
thing?
yes. Thank you.
I think a game changer would be for the governments to provide free or subsidized childcare and elderly care, because that would create such a massive improvement in female participation, because this burden of unpaid work mostly falls on women. And as we are discussing how we can improve productivity, how we can support growth outlook, I mean, this is something which can be quite easily tackled and actually improve the equality between women and men, and the same for shared parental leave, which would again leave the stigma.
And if the government can do this before my due date in February, it would be especially helpful in this country. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Shannon, for having you.
Please welcome to the stage Kamal Bhatia, Chief Operating Officer, Principal Asset Management, and Bloomberg's Sonia Meghi.
Thank you. I was going to say, people have been sitting here for 2 hours. If you want to stand up for 10 seconds, it's all good. You know, I was standing there and I was like, people are fading away. We'll make this better, Sonia.
Thank you so much. So hi, everybody. My name is Sonia Meghi, and I am the EMEA D&I Inclusion Manager here at Bloomberg. And I'm really pleased to be joined by Kamal today, who is the Chief Operating Officer for Principal Asset Management, who are today's sponsor, one of our sponsors. So today we're going to be speaking about building economic resilience through financial inclusion. Welcome, Kamal.
Thank you.
So I have a few questions for you.
Sure.
And I hope that you'll enjoy this moment. And everybody that is here, please do take note, because I'm really excited to hear from Kamal. So resilience is a widely used word at the moment. What are the major components of resilience, and how does financial inclusion help make economies more resilient?
Sure. You know, I think, as you said, it's like if you Google it, resilience seems to be in the top word cloud. And the classic English definition of resilience is an ability to withstand shock. And you know, you could take it further. Like all of you, I read a lot in media. We're at Bloomberg, so we learn a lot about what's going on in the world. And I think post-COVID, one of the biggest things we have learned is this idea of immunity. And I think the world doesn't pay enough attention to economic immunity. I think if you think about the financial landscape, you know, post-World War, we have always been focused on, you know, you turn on the TV and you always see, you know, what the Fed is doing. So you're sort of pumping economic chemicals into the system. And you're trying to deal with tax policy, fiscal policy. And for us, I think it's important to understand economic immunity. And so resilience is your ability to withstand shock. And with that idea in mind, what we did was say, how can we measure immunity of this world? We looked at 42 countries, and we said, how do we classify with deep research around 3 dimensions, which define society for most of us, which is the financial system, because we all live in a financial system, the employers we work for, directly or indirectly, and the government, because we are all part of governments. And so we came up with this idea. You saw a quick video before I came on stage, to really create this idea of global financial inclusion. Yeah. And that's the way I think about it, is measuring immunity in society, measuring immunity at the world across these geographies, and how it could inform us. And from a personal perspective, principal, we have clients in 80 countries, we have staff in 30. I'm an investor at heart, and the view I have is you have to actively invest in thinking beyond what you read. And it's our way of building this index to understand where the world is going next. Yeah. It allows us a sort of an invisible view into equality and progress in society.
Yeah, I really like that, invest in more than what you read. So as you consider the index, which markets stand out to you, positively or negatively, for how they stack up on financial inclusion?
Yeah. So I'll probably start with a positive note, and then we'll go down. As I said, 42 countries. And you will probably see in the report, and I would encourage all of you to get a copy. We could have it sent out. It's a really good report, but there are certain countries which you would logically assume do well on financial inclusion. Yeah. But I'll pick 2 outliers in each categories. So a country that jumped out at me, or 2 countries that jumped out at me on the positive side is Thailand. Mm-hmm. And Thailand, you would not think would be a country in the top 20 of this index. You are comparing it to G20 economies. And if you double click on what Thailand has done, it's ranked 19th. There are a couple of things that are happening in an economy like Thailand that most of us don't understand and talk about. One of the measures we look for is confidence. Yeah. How do you measure confidence in small, medium businesses? And how do you measure confidence of people who work for companies? I can tell you, given where I'm sitting today, that measure is low in a country like UK. And so in Thailand, it jumps out is people who work for companies tend to have a high belief system. Yeah. Small to medium employers tend to have high belief system. And to us, it's a leading indicator of how that society is going to progress and how it's going to become a more important space from capital markets. Some of you may not know, for the last 10 years, and we've been an investor and operate in business in Thailand for a long time. For the last 10 years, the government has been silently working on what's called a national pension scheme. Okay. But they didn't launch it. They've gone through a beta test where they're thinking and learning from all the pension systems of the world of how they provide a benefit to all forms of society, not just people who work for large employers, but small. And that's a fact that most of us will not read about. So Thailand jumps out at us. Malaysia is another one, close neighbors. And Malaysia is number 20. It's on the positive side. One of the things that's defined Malaysia is there has been a very active effort to convert government-based enterprises to become private enterprises. Yeah. It really a purposeful effort, and having society participate in that, but also providing enormous credit growth for an actual citizen in Malaysia, much faster than you see in G7 nations. And so I would highlight those 2 outliers on the positive side. On the negative side, something that jumps out to us, and it saddens me, is if you look at the bottom 10 rankings, 5 of those countries are in Latin America. Wow. You look at the bottom 5, 3 of those are in Latin America. Wow. Latin America as a continent has regressed backward when it comes to inclusion and progressiveness on this measure. Wow. And we could debate why that is happening, but that is an outlier fact. Chile probably is the highest ranked in that group, but that is sort of barbelling it. in some respect, if you think about it. And I wanted to make sure I got the right number for Europe, because there is some interesting facts there as well. So we have what we call the watch list.
Yeah.
And what surprised me on the watch list were 3 countries in Europe. Italy, Spain, I would add France and UK to it.
Okay.
And Italy, anyone venture to guess where Italy would stand in 42 countries? Top 20? 37th.
Okay.
So the state of affairs, just because you're a developed market, isn't great. Partly because I think in a lot of these economies, there has been an over-reliance on government support and not as much push to create financial education and empowerment at the small to medium business level or at the employer level. Yeah. I could go on, but I just wanted to give you some of those facts.
You're quite right, and it's an interesting conversation, and it's an ongoing conversation. And here in the UK, there's a continuous push for us also to just think about the importance of financial inclusion as part of our curriculum.
Mm-hmm.
So it starts from young. So demographics are shifting globally. As we think about work, part-time workers are a growing part of many major economies, but often excluded from comprehensive financial rights. How can we change this, and what is the economic impact if we do not?
I think it's a great question, Sonia. I think more than any time in the last 25 years, I think hybrid and part-time work is increasing across the world. Through COVID, you saw a big growth in where a lot of citizens decided to either check out of the workforce or decide how they want to participate on a part-time basis. And while in many of these countries we can't really measure because we don't get good data on full-time versus part-time, we probably have the deepest set of insights with small to medium businesses in America. We run a lot of their financial plans from a retirement perspective, but we are a big benefit provider. And we do some research with small to medium businesses in America. And if you really think about the heart of America is 10, 20, 25 people operations, and there's a lot of part-time workers. In an economy like UK, you could easily see this, is a biggest part of the economy is tourism and retail, which has a high propensity of part-time workers versus financial services or manufacturing. And if you look at the delta of financial inclusion and security, just on that part-time to full-time, there's a 20 percentage point delta. So if you work full-time, your ability to achieve financial security, your level of benefit and value your employer provides you is 20 percentage points more than somebody working part-time. So the challenge we have as society is how do we provide the same set of tools for part-time workers? Because you can't really have that big a delta in a large society. So to your question, I think it is a problem upon us. I'd probably leave you, I think technology and advice is going to be the big part of that change. A lot of us are going to see over the next few years, but that's something to look for.
No, for sure. And also we think about the percentage of women who sit within that part-time bracket. We've reached our time. So thank you so much for joining me today, Kamal. And thank you for being our principal spotlight as well. And we really appreciate you being here with us today at Bloomberg to discuss financial inclusion.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Up next, a conversation between Gail Whiteman, founder and executive director Arctic Base Camp, and Bloomberg's John Freyer.
Welcome back, everybody. Thank you for joining us for this session on climate justice. The story of climate change, really, when it boils down to it, is a story about justice. We're all going to have to adapt. Every country in the world is going to have to adapt to the impact of climate change. And it goes without saying that the more money that you have, the easier it will be to adapt. The less money that you have, the harder it's going to be to adapt. Added to that, I think it's in a cruel twist of fate, some of the countries that are most geographically exposed to climate change are some of the world's poorest countries. Whether you're a really hot country in sub-Saharan Africa, whether you're a low-lying country like Bangladesh, or as you've seen most recently in the news, if you're a country like Pakistan that's full of melting glaciers, you're going to be feeling the full brunt of climate change without the money that you need to protect yourself from it. So helping, addressing this issue of climate justice is going to be forefront at the COP summit, COP27 summit in Sharm el-Sheikh in a few weeks' time. And I'm delighted to welcome today Professor Gail Whiteman. She's Professor of Sustainability at the University of Exeter Business School and founder of Arctic Base Camp. That's a not-for-profit scientific outreach platform to discuss some of these issues, what progress is being made on the climate justice front, what progress can we expect and hope to see a COP this week. So Professor Whiteman, thank you so much for joining us today. She has actually just come back. You've just come back from the Arctic Circle, I believe. You came back just 2 days ago.
Yeah, I've just come back from the Arctic Circle Assembly in Reykjavik.
Oh, okay. So can you tell us a little bit let's start with climate change and the impacts of climate change. Your work in the Arctic, what sort of impacts are you already seeing in the Arctic of climate change, and what sort of ripple effects are you seeing from that impact through the rest of the world?
Well, I think that it's very clear that the Arctic scientific community have very strong both observational and satellite data that are showing the changes that are happening in the Arctic. Is warming four times faster, and we've got crises happening on the ice sheet in Greenland and also on the land with permafrost. So the Arctic is in crisis and is in itself a climate vulnerable region. But the changes that is happening to the Arctic are driving risks throughout the rest of the world and really ramping up those impacts like the Pakistan floods that you mentioned, the Nigerian floods that are happening right now and beyond. So what happens in the Arctic doesn't stay there. It goes to the rest of the world and is really creating a lot of impacts for people and economies.
And when we talk about climate justice, can you tell us just a little bit about from your work and your sustainability work, which poorer countries, shall we say, do you see as being most at risk from climate change?
Yeah, great. So I'm a social scientist. So what I do is I take the natural science data on Arctic change and climate change more generally, and I bring it into those discussions of risk. And climate justice and injustice is really one of the most important discussions. We can see countries like the Philippines, which have a fraction of 1% of global emissions to date, but are incredibly vulnerable to the impacts. We see the same with Pakistan, Nigeria, large parts of the African continent, the Caribbean, low-lying states, so the island states throughout the world and beyond. And the Arctic itself, communities that live there have had only a tiny impact on global emissions, but are clearly suffering now.
And so before we get on to talking about COP and what we expect from COP, how would you describe the progress made to date on this climate justice issue? I mean, obviously, as I said at the beginning, climate, when you boil down to it, all of it is about climate justice, but this sort of very specific issue about getting money to the poorer countries who can't afford adaptation. How would you describe the progress that's been made over the last 5 to 10 years on that score?
No progress is how I would say it in a nutshell. I mean, it boggles the mind that we can see these impacts happening. We know from a scientific perspective they are being caused and accelerated by climate change, and the rich countries around the world are ignoring that, despite whatever commitments they may make at previous COPs. They're just not transferring those finances to those that are suffering.
And the international community talks about $100 billion a year, which we're still waiting for. That's money transferred from the global north to the global south. A, how long do you think it's going to be before that becomes a regular payment? And B, is that enough? And if not, how much more money needs to be? Can we quantify the amount of money that we're actually talking about here?
Well, I don't think we can quantify all of the money that's needed, but certainly the economic integrated assessment models that we've done on even things of losing our Arctic sea ice and permafrost thaw, which would be huge tipping points, but we're well on track to trigger those. We're talking trillions of US dollars impact over time. The issue with climate justice, of course, is not just the loss and damage right now or in the next 20 years, it's over the next 100 years, 200 years. Those communities will either still be suffering or they will have migrated, which is going to cause conflict globally. In terms of when is the 100 billion going to happen? Well, I would say it's got to start happening in Egypt, in Sharm el-Sheikh. Do I believe that's going to happen? The jury's out from my mind. I just cannot believe that we keep delaying it. On the one good side, I do see coming from Glasgow COP26 a loss and damage back on the agenda in a significant way. And that's thanks to a lot of different actors and the Climate Vulnerable Forum, certainly, which is a very, I think, inspirational group of 55 climate vulnerable countries around the world, has been massively pushing that. Certainly Bangladesh was the chair last year, and I think Bangladesh, Ghana, and others are pushing very strong in Egypt as well.
And just to clarify for the non-sort of climate experts here, loss and damage is essentially it's a climate reparations, right? So again, like Pakistan, we talked about, Pakistan would argue, historically speaking, we've only contributed a tiny, tiny, tiny fraction of the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, and we are paying an unfair part of the impact of climate change, even though we didn't cause it. So we need reparations.
John, and if I could give you an example, the Pakistan floods alone, not only was it a humanitarian disaster, but estimates are that the economic impact was somewhere around $30 billion US dollars. So that's just one event. They're not small potatoes here. And for countries that are already struggling with poverty alleviation, food and water security, adding in these kind of costs is crippling.
And do you think the moral charge of the imagery from Pakistan was incredible? For those of you who haven't seen it, I mean, it's some of the most striking video I've seen in recent years of the climate crisis. Do you feel that the moral charge of that event, of that tragedy, will move the needle a little bit as we get closer to COP and get down to these loss and damage negotiations?
I think it helps. I think the fact that we've now got Nigeria, we also had, Hurricane Ian hit in the state of Florida, which, although the U.S. is not a climate vulnerable, undeveloped country, it certainly has massive parts of it that are poor, marginalized people that are picking up the costs within those kinds of countries. I'm not sure it's enough. I think the thing that scared me the most in Reykjavik last week was the data that I saw from the Indian delegation, where they were looking at how the Arctic, for example, was going to be threatening the Asian monsoon. And if we start to see massive changes in the monsoon, we are talking affecting billions of people in terms of fundamental food and water security. And that kind of humanitarian disaster, I don't actually know how those regions in the world would recover from that. So the question is, can people see these terrible things that are happening now as just a small example of what can happen relatively quickly? And I just don't know yet. Egypt itself, in terms of a climate vulnerable country, is incredibly vulnerable to sea level rise, and in fact is itself a victim of climate injustice. So let's hope their negotiating team pushes those buttons. But I just simply don't know. I think when we look at the elephant in the room in Europe, it is the war and the threats to energy security, and where we actually see even European countries that have been strong proponents of cutting emissions, going back to whether that's coal, or we see the rise of the discussion on fracking in the UK, that's going in the wrong direction because of short-term crises, which I understand. But all I can say is that the physics is not going to change. And if we're going to actually bend the emissions curve in half by 2030, we cannot delay it. So, the pressure is on.
The climate story, there's a lot to be bleak about, there's a lot to be concerned about. But in terms of like signs of hope, signs of optimism, if you could sort of list three things where you think we are going in the right direction and do offer a glimmer of hope that we might get out of this crisis, what would you cite?
Well, I would say certainly the unusual collaborations across different kinds of stakeholder groups. In particular, I find hope coming from the work that's happening with non-state actors like the mayors of big, large urban cities around the world, and also some of the large multinationals. The trick is, can they work together to really deal with the hotspots around the world and build resilience and adaptive capacity and hopefully significant mitigation so that we can avoid the worst of the climate emergency. So, when we were in Glasgow, the fact that there were so many corporate leaders at the CEO level, there was a lot of investors that were pledging major dollars, major pounds of investment in the low carbon economy. That was different than previous COPs. And I think that is a sign of hope. The trigger will be is, do they actually act? And do they really act in a science-backed way? I think that's the key thing. We cannot just simply say we're going to act and then invest in non-sustainable alternatives. And an example is the COVID economic recovery funds that were once in a lifetime scale across the world of investment. A very few percentage points, maybe 21%, was actually fueling the green economy. That's a missed opportunity, but we can start to realign those investments now. When we look in Europe and we look at the rightful need to build Ukraine back, hopefully when a peace is attained, hopefully sooner rather than later. When we brought the top climate scientists from Ukraine to Davos in May this year, her call was strongly, if you're building Ukraine back, build it back as a beacon of low carbon hope. So build it back in a low carbon way. So those voices and the fact that they're getting out there, I think is important. It's really going to be, how do we act and how do we encourage that kind of unusual collaboration?
Is that all? I mean, again, this is a discussion in a panel about climate justice and climate adaptation in poorer parts of the world. Do you see that sort of unusual, different kind of collaboration? Is that happening in the developing world as well?
Yeah, for example, I did a presentation on climate risk and strategic leadership to a extremely large Philippines-based headquartered company a few weeks ago. I talked to company heads all around the world, and what I show them is their risks in their own country, and you simply cannot have a good economy when your communities are going to be suffering. So I see how they're linking in with their colleagues and leaders, business leaders in the developed world, and putting pressure on them, quite frankly. And I think that is the way to go. I think the missing point, John, and how I'm ending all of my conversations with business, with science, with government, is the need for courage. We need courageous leadership. We need to dig deep and actually make those, I think, difficult decisions and do what we think is impossible. There's no way out of this. We cannot delay it. And I said that recently to the CEO of one of Europe's largest renewable companies, who at the same time was saying that, hey, we've got to get energy security in Europe. There's, it's coming in winter. People are suffering because of the war and the changes in the energy system dynamics. And I said, fair enough, but I think that the only question I have is, where are you going to make the cuts later on, you and the larger energy system, because we don't have more time. The clock is very close to midnight.
That is very, very true. Well, we only have a few minutes left, but before we close, I think it'd be great if you could just give this audience maybe just a little primer on getting back to the loss and damage question. We are going into COP in a few weeks' time. It's going to be running for 2 weeks in Sharm el-Sheikh. Loss and damage is going to be a big part of it. Certainly the developing world really wants to get it under the agenda. Can you talk a little bit about sort of the fault lines, the dividing lines, and what this audience should be looking out for and what progress might look like?
Well, I think that there's a few things. I mean, I think that climate injustice is spanning the gamut of different kinds of countries. So certainly, the Chinese arguments for climate injustice are out there. It has not been historically driven by Chinese emissions, but China, of course, is a huge economic powerhouse and is a big emitter country, as is India. So there are definitely fault lines within that. Both of those major emitting countries that are economic powerhouses are arguing certain ways. Then we've got the poorer developed countries that are really suffering from loss and damage and are not economic powerhouses. And that's where they have coalitions of, say, the Climate Vulnerable Forum. Everybody wants more justice, but some are arguing that gives them the right to emit more and longer, and others are saying, look, we need help in both the transition and in actually paying for the damages that we've got. At the same time, we can see how in the developed world where they commit happily or perhaps unhappily, but certainly they commit to giving $100 billion investment in the low carbon economy transition in the developing world, but they don't actually deliver on it. So talk is cheap. It's really about how are we going to move forward. I think there will be there'll be debates about what is loss and damage. How do we know an event is related to climate change? Is it the full event? Is it part of the event? I mean, we've always had floods, we've always had hurricanes, we've always had typhoons, etc. I think the real question is how much of that is ramped up and what does that mean on the price tag? But that being said, again, we need to not just look at loss and damages. We actually need to scale up mitigation pledges and reductions and emissions. That's the key thing, because loss and damages will just climb if we don't actually get to as close as possible to a 1.5C world, which the commitments right now are just not there.
Well, we are out of time. We could talk about this all morning. Thank you, Professor, for all of your time this morning, for a very stimulating conversation. Thank you to the audience for listening. Thank you
very much, everybody.
Please welcome Nadia Youssef, Managing Director and Partner, BCG, and Bloomberg's Duncan Chater.
Good morning, everyone. So I'm delighted to be joined today by Nadia Youssef, who is MD and partner for BCG, for today's sponsor spotlight on advancing women in tech, the economic imperative. So welcome, Nadia.
Thank you so much for having me, Duncan.
Pleasure. So obviously today we're talking about technology, which is a huge sector, really important, playing a vital role for our future. How can recruiting, retaining and advancing women be a key driver for helping build inclusive economies?
Great. So we always talk about how tech is, the fourth industrial revolution. We talk about how there are so many things that tech can solve, whether it's the climate crisis, education gap. But what we sometimes forget is that there are people who fuel that. People who fuel that, who have opinions, who have skills, and the more diverse the workforce who is part of that tech industry, the better the outcomes can be for a more diverse population. However, we know that at the moment, only 20% of those people who are studying technical skills are women. We also know that in tech leadership today, it's about 20 to 25% women in those positions. So we are not yet at that place where we can have that diverse set of opinions, if you will, participating in this big wave of the economy. And we also know that 9 out of 10 of the most lucrative positions in the future are going to be in tech. And being able to have an inclusive population be part of that means that we will be able to affect, frankly, more broadly, economic equality, which is why we talk about having then the levers of recruitment, retention, and advancement in organizations who are working on tech be inclusive.
Right. So, and I know we were chatting just beforehand, you were saying obviously you've done some research into how companies in tech can close the gender pay gap.
Yeah.
Can you share a bit of information on that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Because, yeah, obviously really, really great insight.
Yeah. So we looked at how different paths to the top have been experienced between men and women in tech. And firstly, I'm going to start with the similarities. So you have both men and women demonstrating exceptional technical skills when they rise to the top. No surprise there. You have also men and women who are willing to take risks. They actually enjoy taking risks in terms of putting themselves forward for new opportunities. And they're flexible in terms of the roles they take, the geographies they operate in, and the functions they undertake. Those are things in common. And also, I would add, they are ambitious. So we sometimes hear about an ambition gap. Men are more ambitious than women. Actually, our research showed that that is a myth. So women are as equally wanting to have that next career step just as much as men are. However, there are certain challenges that women face that our study showed are happening around the world. So we looked at multiple different countries. So firstly, women take longer career breaks. That affects their advancement. You see it sometimes order of magnitude different. So in some countries, like in Germany, women take 4 times as long time off for parental leave than men do. You also see that women have to prove their technical skills more than men. You might have heard of something called an authority gap. That is something that we found in our research was confirmed. Women are second-guessed more about their technical skills, which obviously in the tech world makes a difference in your ability to rise to the top. And then we also found, I guess, more softer things, just to pull up one or two more. Women have fewer role models. That makes it harder to, of course, envision where they might be. They might be opting out more. And also, when it comes to pursuing that next step, you know, we heard earlier today mention of sponsorship and mentorship being important for women and minorities in general to advance. It's super important for women. That is the way in which they rely upon for thinking, yes, I can achieve that next career step. And actually, for women of color, this is particularly important. So our research showed that women of color, especially in a hybrid setting, have found it harder to form strong relationships with mentors or sponsors. So something really important as we look at the differences between men and women is that role of external networks.
Right. I'm conscious of time, but one thing that came up in one of the sessions earlier today was reference, obviously, the challenges around talent. I think Anne mentioned it in the opening session. How quickly do you think we can make progress in the tech sector? And I guess also alongside that, we've got a lot of executives here in the room. What advice would you give them of what they can do with their businesses, particularly in this sector?
Well, I'm glad you asked the question, Duncan, because I have some advice, and as I'm on stage, I will give it. We have 4 recommendations for organizations to really move the needle. And genuinely, to answer your question, I think we could go from 20 to 25% women in tech leadership to, let's say, 30% within 5 years, genuinely. If you do the math, it works out. Here are the 4 things. 1, create support networks. Invest in mentorship schemes, sponsorship schemes, coaching, affiliation networks. They make a difference. 2, promote role models. Be role models yourself, whether you're a man, woman. Be a role model and promote them and make sure that you are shining a light on them. Thirdly, create inclusive culture when it comes to caregiving, when it comes to respecting caregiving rules, when it comes to creating a culture where it's celebrated to take time off. And then finally, make sure that you are measuring this. So if it's not discussed at the boardroom, it's not really going to be tracked. So that's the fourth and quite critical measure. And I think with these in place, organizations can get to, and we talk about the 30% number being an important one because some studies have shown that tech organizations with 30% women in leadership have 15% higher profits. So this really pays off.
Wow, well, that's a nice message to end on, isn't it? Thank you very much, Nadia. It's been a pleasure having you. I think some great insights and information to share with the group here. So
Great.
thank you.
Thank you so much.
Please welcome Luke Ellis, CEO, Man Group, and Bloomberg's Francine Lacroix.
Hi, everyone. Luke, thank you so much for joining us.
Pleasure.
2022, and we have a Bloomberg Equality Summit. Is it more important now than it was 2 years ago?
Well, we have to keep making progress, right? And we've got a lot to do, and the world is looking after people harder and harder. Inflation is bad for equality. So, yes, I guess it is more important than it was 2 years ago, even though I pause because 2 years ago was right in the middle of COVID, and inequality was pretty bad in COVID.
So what's the pace like? I know we need to continue making progress, but is it a little bit at a glacial pace that we're looking at equality because we're so distracted by inflation, which I have a great poll on in a second. We're so distracted by the economy going under and all of these, little perfect storms that could create a huge turbulent time.
I always think the thing is you've got to keep making progress. And as long as you're making forward progress, that's better than anything else. Right, so it's easy to complain things aren't going quickly enough, and I wish they were. I've been in the city for nearly 40 years. There's been an enormous amount of progress here, but it's still got a lot further to go. I was interested in that tech panel just before. 30% leadership in tech is a long way away from where we are now. If it's achieved in 5 years, that's brilliant. If it's achieved in 7 or 9, as long as we're getting there, that's what matters.
So we look at inflation day in, day out. Is inflation really bad for inequality? Does it really exacerbate the differences we already have?
Yeah, I'm afraid it does. And I mean, here it's about income inequality. So there's lots of different forms of equality, right? But in the end, inflation is worst for the least well-off in society. And so higher inflation, the more you spend on food and the more you spend on accommodation and heating, the worse inflation is for you. And so, that's the challenge, is it makes inequality worse. The other side of it is the solutions for inflation also hurt the worse off in society. I'm afraid being rich is a protected species. The only thing that changes that is taxation on the rich, which is difficult to achieve.
Okay, we have a poll, so 2-year QR codes talking about inequality and central banks. Have central bank policies in the last 10 years created more inequality? I think that's your A option. We should have it somewhere on screen. Your B option is, have central banks created less inequality? And then the third one is no impact on inequality. I mean, I don't know what you choose out of this. It could be unintended.
Then we have to let them answer first. Otherwise, they'll all say the opposite of me.
We'll give you 20 seconds. Just to I think it's just stabilizing a little bit. I mean, I don't know. Is it the job of more inequality, 75% for the moment, and it's 79%? Okay, it's stabilizing. Is it, first of all, before we get to the polls and what you think, whether it's created or not, is it the job of central banks to look at inequality?
So I would say no. That's not the job of one of the things of central banks is they need to be given simple mandates. The more complicated the mandate, the more it has to go to the hands of politicians whose job is to make trade-offs all the time. Central bankers, in the end, they have a series of tools, all of which work in roughly the same way. They think of it as many tools. Mostly it's one tool just used in different forms. And so I think you need central banks to have simple mandates. And we see in the US that the combined mandate of full employment and low inflation, or low and steady inflation, has created a problem where the Fed focused too much on one and lost control of the other.
So it's settling at 78% of people in the room think that it has created more inequality. and 11% both ways, no impact or less inequality. Would you have said more inequality?
I would have said more inequality because it's the format of what the central banks did. So, look, the initial process about QE and or pushing very loose monetary policy was necessary in order to get out of some of the problems the world had. There's a point where more and more loose monetary policy was creating problems. One of the problems is the inflation that we've now got. It obviously needed a catalyst to set it off. The other is what it did was to push asset prices up everywhere to levels that I think we can now all admit were unsustainable. But high asset prices are good for the rich and not good for they don't do anything useful for the poor. So it increased the inequality by making the rich feel even richer.
But so, look, how do we reset? So we all want a fairer society. It's been 10 years of this, central banks putting so much cheap money out there that the rich have gotten more. COVID, again, we saw that change between, the haves and the have-nots. And now we go into, even more inequality because of austerity, possibly.
Well, nobody said economics was easy.
Yeah.
And we've got a whole load of imbalances which have really built up. And I think a lot of them have got to be undone over the course of things. That can be done in ways that increase inequality or ways that decrease inequality. One of the challenges of society is, in the end, the rich is going to have to pay more dollars of tax. Now, there are questions about what the way to get the rich to pay more dollars of tax. The rich are generally good at avoiding tax or earn their money in ways which are not particularly taxed. Even something like the carried interest in the US not getting through is a sort of remarkable idea because it's only for the very wealthy that might possibly be a useful opportunity. So, so governments are faced with the challenge of how they get more dollars of tax out of the rich. There are different ideas, but that's going to have to happen in order to reduce inequality. In order to reduce poverty is different questions, right? And so as we've seen in China, while inequality has on many measures gone up in China in the last 20 years, they've taken, pick your number, 600-800 million people out of poverty. But it doesn't mean that there won't be some people who end up very rich at the end of it.
So what's the right way of looking at it? Should we reduce poverty or reduce inequality? Because we've seen so much division, right, in our society.
So I think when it comes to wealth, personally, I think it's about reducing poverty. So reducing absolute poverty. The relative measures on wealth are, they are by nature relative, and successful economies work with, we're not all given exactly the same gifts, tools, training, so on and so forth. We can do lots to equalize opportunity, but even if you give perfect equal opportunity, you won't get the same outcomes, and some people will be more successful than others. Personally, I'm a believer in that's okay, and you should reward that. But what we should do is try and pull as many people out of absolute poverty as possible. Nobody should have to worry about whether they can turn their heating on, or that the form of heating they have might kill them because it's a gas fire in a small enclosed room that the fumes from that might do them more harm than the heating. So, absolute poverty is the world's real challenge, and in the end, it is the West's real challenge as well, I would say.
How does inflation look like from here? So again, inflation is a direct tax almost on the ones that have the least. Does it get much worse from here? In the UK, we're at 10%.
10% is pretty bad. 10% is inflation out of control. It's 8% in the US. There's a set of maths which says it will likely come down over the course of the next 6-9 months. But I don't think we've yet seen enough central bank action to get rid of inflation. And one of the things of inflation is you've really got to, it's like a sort of fire. You've got to stamp it right out and make sure there's no smoke left whatsoever. Otherwise, it will reignite. And my worry is what is likely to happen is that central banks and governments don't want to take the immediate action in the end, they should have taken the immediate action 2 years ago, not, it's sort of too late today, but every time you put it off increases the likely problem in the future.
Which means that governments have to give back, this government needs to give back to make sure that a lot of people are supported. Is that the right way of, it's difficult to argue otherwise.
Has to work out what they're trying to do. That's trying to give too much commentary on this government at the moment is a bit tricky. But in the course of sorting out deficit problems, you can focus deficit action in things which penalize the least fortunate in society, or you can focus on things which help them relatively. So that's clearly a place to focus first and foremost. The reality, though, is we've got inflation, which means we've got higher interest rates, and I don't think we've seen the highest level of interest rates yet for this cycle at all. And that naturally moves wealth around in the economy. People with floating mortgages or people with mortgages coming up for renewal are facing a significant reduction in their sense of wealth. I'm afraid that's what happens in these things. If you don't have a mortgage, higher interest rates are not that much of a problem.
But how much, again, this is a huge readjustment, especially for, it's a generational, society where we're just not used to high inflation. We're not used to mortgages at like 5-6%.
Yeah, it's definitely a generational question. My first mortgage had a 17% coupon, if I remember rightly. And in my career, 5% was a normal government interest rate. I learned all the tricks for how you present valued bonds and worked out duration off a 5% coupon because it was nice and easy. A 5-year, 5% coupon has a 4-year duration. It was like, that was the sort of rules of thumb you learned.
No rules anymore.
And so that was the middle of the range. And you're right, in the last 20 years, people have got used to the idea that 1-2% interest rates is the middle of the range. History says 2% is not a high enough interest rate for the middle of the range. And so, there are plenty of individuals and plenty of businesses and plenty of governments that have taken on too much debt on the assumption interest rates would always be very low. What's that done? That they pulled consumption forward and they're going to have to pay it back now, I'm afraid.
So we talked a little bit about the government. Until last Thursday, it was, I'm sure even now, but it was certainly until last Thursday, it was the most diverse government in the UK in the last 40 years. Mm-hmm. Does that make a difference?
I think it's, look, in thinking about equality of opportunity is super important. And 30 years ago, we used to have a white male government and that was it. And to have a very diverse government shows opportunities have been increased to get into politics if that's what you want to do. We can debate whether that's a good thing to want to do, but lots of people do. And I think it was one of David Cameron's best achievements was to really broaden the people that were coming into the Conservative Party in politics. And as you can see, that there's quite an open process for getting to the top of that. So that's a good thing, and it shows people role models and opportunity. Now, it would be nicer if they were more successful role models than getting to the top and then falling over, right? But I think focusing on getting broad access to good education, broad access to getting into interesting jobs, broad access to promotion through life, we should all want 100% of society to have the chance to be the best they can be. In the UK, we have a problem with white working class boys who, are some of the part of society with the least aspiration for what they can achieve and thereby achieving very little. So one should be careful about using any physical metric as the one way to think about equality of opportunity, diversity. Every piece matters, and that's one of the challenges, right? It's like we all want to pick one thing and focus on it, and increasing gender diversity is super important. Increasing racial diversity is super important, but equally so is the thing of looking after any of the other parts of society that don't get equal opportunity.
But so that's what, just making a fairer society, and what are the priorities
Well, that is
for
what
any government?
equality is about,
Right.
right?
And how do you achieve that? Is it apprenticeships? Like, how do you get people moving?
I'm not a believer in there being any silver bullet that will sort all of these things out. One of the things I thought was going to come out when the person before talked about if you can get to 30%, and suddenly she started talking about that was a gender one, but you get to 30% of some equality, so some minority becoming 30% in a particular operation in a business, she started talking about returns. Actually, what I've seen is if you can get to 30%, what happens is equality of voice. So when we started trying to diversify our board, you know, the first woman on our board had a terribly difficult time getting heard and wanting to talk up. Once we got to 3 women out of 10 people on the board, suddenly it was sort of much easier, and everybody listened, and then we went from 3 to 5 and a gender equal board really quickly because it was natural. You know, I think that type of thing, you have to get to critical mass, and you get to critical mass with a series on whatever the thing you're trying to change. You know, it takes a lot of proactive effort, make something, and the changes are small. But if you keep doing it, you get to a point where momentum takes over, and you achieve critical mass, momentum takes over, and after that, it's easy.
And that's how you get away from groupthink, I guess.
Oh, so I mean that's the point from if you're in a people business, if you're in a knowledge business, which we certainly are, everybody in the city is in some form, you know, the more different thought processes you can have into an idea, the better the likely collective answer will be. And I think one of the things when people are recruiting, they're, you know, God forbid you leave tomorrow, you know, the bosses at Bloomberg will go, okay, we need somebody to replace Francine, and they will have, okay, let's pick somebody, they're going to naturally think of somebody that's exactly like you, right?
Funny.
Now, you're very good at it. Well, exactly. You could choose the list of criteria. Not paid enough, but that didn't. The thing is, because they're looking for somebody who can replace you immediately tomorrow. And if you want somebody to replace someone immediately tomorrow, you naturally hire in their image. Because that's you create a Francine-sized hole, and therefore a perfectly Francine-looking person is the natural replacement. What we realized and try to do now is to not think about who's the right person to hire to fill a gap today, but rather who is the person we can hire that in 3 years' time, this team will be more productive. And it's a sort of subtle but actually really important leap in mentality, because that gives the person time to pick up the specialist skills that, you know, the next person that takes over from you won't be as practiced at doing the things you do because you've been doing them. But will they in 3 years be part of a good team? That's how, you know, and it's collective IQ is much better than individual IQ.
But that's hard because it's also looking at the trends of what happens to your business in 3 years.
Yeah, but you know, you should be thinking ahead in running a business. You should be
at least 3 years.
Like sort of, I mean, you know, it's not easy to get to this job. It's not supposed to be easy when you get there, right? If you are leading an organization, even if you're just leading a team, you know, you've got there because you hopefully have shown some special skills, not just survivability. And what's one of those things is about how do you build a team and how do you keep the team operating together. But a really important thing shouldn't be looking at your feet every day and what's immediately here, but looking up and looking ahead and thinking about how is this team going to be in 3 years' time. So certainly we have a regular session at the firm level, but all the way through to different areas where talent planning, talent mapping, where you're looking, what you've got today, but where are the gaps? Where are the opportunities? Who are the people you can progress? What do we need to do and how is the team going to look in 3, 4, 5 years? And that's where you should be thinking about people and creating futures for them.
Look, if you look at UK financial services, so you're part of Progress Together, which basically tries to bridge this inequality economically, so different backgrounds.
Yeah, exactly.
Are you? I mean, is it frustratingly slow?
So that's a new initiative because, you know, if I look over my time in the city, you know, I've said it often, it was a horrifically misogynist and non-diverse place when I first arrived in the city, and, you know, it's got further to go to be fully diverse, but it's come a long way. Against that, sort of social mobility has in some ways gone down in the city over time. You know, part of the sort of academic achievement thing that, you know, sort of, you know, whatever the last 20, 30 years has been more and more everybody has to go to university, and of course you couldn't possibly hire even an assistant for your business who hasn't been to university, and what that does is take away a lot of opportunities for social mobility. You know, the sort of what used to be joked about of the sort of Essex barrow boy, not even sure what a barrow boy is anymore, but sort of was one of the groups of people in the city, and that got phased out by the sort of urge towards higher and higher education achievements. And what we know in social mobility is, you know, that there are parts of our society who don't even imagine going to university, and so you need to do things to create pathways for them into university, pathways into good university, but also pathways for them into the city. And I think, you know, we can definitely do better. I'm always frustrated when, you know, you hear people say, oh, it's, you know, it's only the Eton and Oxbridge people who end up running businesses. I'm not one of those people at all. You can do it, but we should make it easier for people to come in, and, you know, social mobility is an important part of it.
But whose job is that? Is it public? You know, is it private?
I think all of these things need both, right? I mean, in the end, if you get into a position of leadership, I think your job is to leave, maybe it's all of our job is to leave the world in a better place than when we started. But in the end, when you're young, it's about trying to earn enough money to eat a hard meal every day or 2 meals a day, and then it's about getting some savings. You know, and there's that Quaker expression, I'm not a Quaker, but the sort of idea of spend a third of your life learning, a third of your life earning, and a third of your life giving back is a nice concept. In the end, we have to balance our lives. But when you get into a leadership position, if you are then selfish, well, bad on you, right? The more of a leadership position you get into, the more you should think about helping the people in your team and the society around you, because you're given a platform where you can do it. And so, yeah, I think all of the leaders in the city should be thinking about what they can do, should be involved in giving money back to charity, involved in as many different ways of leaving society in a better shape.
Luke, thank you so much for your time today.
Great pleasure. Thank you.
Lunch in the pre-function space outside, but for anyone who's invited to the BCG workshop, there will be also hosts outside. So enjoy, everyone, and have a great day.